As we talked about in the previous lecture, every time a user puts in an input in the command line, it's going to emit an event on the back end. e.emit, and then the named event, which can be one of these names, and then the string that they actually entered. In this lecture, we are going to build handlers for each of these events being emitted, and we're going to build responders which can respond and write the text of the console that the admin is asking for. So we're going to say up here, we're going to put our input handlers, which we're actually going to bind to the events. And then just below it, we're going to put our responders. We're going to say that CLI responders is an object, and then we can write each of the responders as a key on that object. The input handlers are not an object because they are really just binds to different events. Let's see what we mean here. Let's bind to the man event that we could emit. So we want to say e on man, and then define the function that should get called, which will take in the string that the user wrote. And now we've bound to that event. So we didn't have to define CLI.handlers.e.on or anything like that. We are just calling e, our events class, and saying on the man event. So when the man event gets emitted, call this here. Now inside of it, we want to call a responder, which we will define below. So let's call CLI.responders.help, because we want to call a responder that we'll call help. And down below, we can create that responder. In the next lectures, we'll actually fill in what these responders do. But for now, we'll just log out that we received the question. So this is going to be help/man CLI.responders.help is a function. We don't actually need to take in a string here because we've already identified the question we're asking. We don't need any more information. And we just want to log out, you asked for help. Now, as I mentioned, there is another input called help that should actually have the same response. And so we're going to define a different input handler for help because we need to bind to this unique event. But it's going to pass things along to the same responder. So e.on help is going to be another anonymous function that calls CLI.responders.help. So there isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship between the handlers that bind to the events and the responders that respond to them. Now let's go through and just quickly create the rest of the handlers for the rest of the questions that could be asked, and then we'll fill in the rest of the responders. So I'm going to copy this help one, and we want to say that e on exit is another string that they could enter. We want to call CLI.responders.exit. And we don't need to pass it a string because it's already identified the question. On the event called stats, we want to call CLI responders stats. On the event list users, we want to call CLI.responders.list users. On the event more user info, we actually do want to pass this string to the responder because remember, the user is going to be entering more user info dash and then the ID of a specific user. So we need to look at the string they're entering in order to identify which user they're asking about. So we want to call CLI.responders.more user info and pass the string that we received to that responder. Next, we want to bind to the event called list checks, take in the string, and then call a responder called list checks. and we do want to pass that a string. And that is because list checks can include a flag for only the up checks or only the down checks. So again, we need to not just identify the question, but identify the flags that have added to this command. And so we need to look at the actual string. Next, we want to bind to more check info. And that's going to be the exact same thing where we actually want to send them the string to a responder called more check info, because more check info needs to look at the string and figure out which ID of which check they're actually asking a question about. For the next one, we want to bind to list logs. List logs doesn't take any flags, and so we can take in the string there, but we don't need to pass it to the responder. We want to call CLI.responders.list logs and not pass it anything at all. Lastly, we want to bind to an event called more log info, call a responder called more log info, and actually pass it the string, because we need to know which log the user is asking questions about. So as you can see, we're calling a whole bunch of responders here, but those responders don't exist down here except for the help one. And so let's go ahead and create those now. Exit. I'm going to copy what we have up here. CLI.responders.exit is just going to say, you asked for exit. In the future lecture, we're going to fill all these in, but we're just building in more scaffolding now. Stats is going to say, you asked for stats. List users is going to say, you asked to list users. More user info is going to actually take in a string and then say, you asked for more user info, and then log out the string that the user included. List checks is going to take in a string, which again is just a flag saying up checks or down checks, and then it'll say, you asked to list checks, and it will log out the string. More check info will be similar. It'll take in a string and say, you asked for more check info, and then the string. Now we need to do list logs. It doesn't take in a string, and so we just want to say, you asked to list logs. And lastly, more logs info, which does take in a string, and we want to say, you asked for more log info, and then log out the string. So there we have it. We can start the app back up and see how these are working. Let's call man. You asked for help. Let's call help. You asked for help. Let's call something that we can't identify. Sorry, try again. Let's call the rest of the commands. Exit. You asked for exit. Stats. You asked for more log info undefined, which means I must have something wrong here. I forgot to change the name of this responder, which should be more log info. Let's start this back up. And let's ask for stats again. You asked for stats. List users. You asked to list users. More user info, and then let's include ID, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You asked for more user info, and then this is the string we wrote. More user info, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now let's ask to list checks up. You asked to list checks up. Now let's get more check info about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You asked for more check info 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's list the logs. You asked to list logs and more log info TTTTT. You asked for more log info and you said more log info TTTTT. So all of these CLI handlers are binding to the correct events now, and the responders are set up to log out in response. Now we can move on to building each of these responders out a little bit more so that they can give the true responses in response to these questions. So now we can move on to the next lecture.